Hello everyone out there, how's it going? Welcome back to my channel. My name is Megan. I'm a certified holistic nutritionist for those of you who are new here, but if you are not new here, then welcome back. Happy to have you all here with me today. Today's video, I am going to be talking all about gluten and what it is and whether or not it's healthy. Is it something that we should eat? Is it something that we should avoid? So let's get into it. So the gluten-free diet has kind of exploded in recent years, maybe over the past decade or so, because of more support for those with celiac disease and emerging research on things like gluten sensitivities. And just the general increase in prevalence of these kinds of things. And you know what? I love seeing that there is so much more support for people who need to avoid gluten. This is a really good thing. But at the same time, the kind of booming gluten-free industry has stirred up quite a bit of confusion about whether or not everyone should go gluten-free, and maybe this is something that you have thought about before. So what exactly is gluten? So gluten is the name of a family of proteins, namely gliadin and glutenin, that are found in some really specific types of grains, being wheat and some of the wheat subtypes like spelt and kamut, as well as rye and barley, and products that are made from these specific grains like bread and pasta and crackers and bagels, these kinds of things. Gluten can also be found sometimes kind of hidden in different sauces or seasonings. Even some supplements and medications can contain traces of gluten. So nowadays, people are avoiding gluten for all manner of reasons, but I want to talk about three very, very specific groups of people who do, in fact, need to avoid gluten before we get on to the rest of what I'm going to be talking about today. So the first group of people who need to avoid gluten are those who have celiac disease. So celiac disease is an autoimmune condition, and people who have this condition cannot handle even tiny amounts of gluten, okay? Even teeny tiny amounts of gluten can elicit a very, problematic immune reaction, whereby the gluten actually wreaks havoc on the tissues in the small intestine. And this can lead to things like malabsorption, so nutrient deficiencies. It can cause pain, diarrhea, a lot of abdominal discomfort, bowel irregularities, and even in some cases, if it's left untreated, can lead to things like osteoporosis and a number of other issues if it's left untreated. The next group of people who absolutely should be avoiding gluten is those who have a wheat allergy. So this is an actual immune reaction to the grain itself, wheat, that contains gluten. Okay, and the third group of people who should be avoiding gluten are those who have gluten sensitivity. So also known as non-celiac gluten sensitivity. This can generate symptoms that are similar to celiac disease, okay? So bloating, pain, diarrhea, but without any of the intestinal damage. So there's no damage from this condition, there's just discomfort. Celiac disease and wheat allergy need to be ruled out before gluten sensitivity can be confirmed, but there are actually no validated tests for gluten sensitivity. You can't go to the doctor and get tested for gluten sensitivity. That doesn't yet exist. So elimination diets are usually what are used here. Now, there is some controversy about gluten sensitivity only because there are other elements of wheat, like the grain itself, that can be causing issues besides gluten itself. So for example, wheat germ lectins, FODMAPs, and I'm going to talk about some of these things in a moment. So those are the three groups of people who should be, in fact, avoiding gluten. Now let's talk about some other factors here to consider when it comes to what might cause us to have issues with what seems like digesting gluten. So the first one here is FODMAPs, which I mentioned a moment ago. So a lot of people avoid gluten because they believe that they are sensitive to it. And in some cases, this is completely true, right? People can definitely be sensitive to gluten, but gluten-containing grains contain a very high FODMAP, short chain carbohydrate, known as an oleosaccharide. If you want to know more about what FODMAPs are, I have a whole blog post on them. But basically this particular kind of carbohydrate is very rapidly fermented in the large intestine by the bacteria in our colon that causes a lot of bloating and gas and in some cases diarrhea. And so because of this, there's often confusion. People think that they're reacting to gluten, but they're actually just having an intolerance to this type of carbohydrate that's found in many wonderful healthy foods, just also happens to be found in wheat and such. It's called fructans. So what this means in short is that gluten might not necessarily be the culprit for a lot of people, but it might be the FODMAPs that are present. Another point to consider here is the fact that the modern wheat that we eat today is the product of multiple rounds of hybridization. So industrial food manufacturing has played a role in modern wheat today being bred to contain more gluten, to make it doughier and stretchier. Gluten is even added sometimes to baked goods and breads and things like that. So there's even more gluten added on top, not to mention many additives like flavor enhancers and stabilizers, etc., that are often added to commercially baked goods. So these are some reasons potentially why some people are having more issues with digesting wheat products nowadays than they did in the past, where bread, for example, is just flour and water, which I'm going to talk about next. As mentioned, there are other non-gluten components of wheat, such as lectins, that can play a role in its digestibility. And a fundamental step in traditional bread making is the fermentation process, whereby lactic acid bacteria helps to break down parts of the grains and in some cases, removes lectins and phytates. But again, the kind of industrial, bread manufacturing process has sort of, let go of that long, slow fermentation process of breads and of grains, so that we can produce loaves of bread much quicker without having that traditional long, slow fermentation process of our grains. It can be much harder for us to digest grains. The next point I want to talk about here that can play a role in how we digest gluten, but also just food in general, is stress, and this can't be underestimated. So maybe you can think of a time where you have felt really nervous, maybe before a presentation, and you just gotta run to the bathroom, you got some diarrhea. It's happened to me. Hello. This kind of connection here between the brain and the gut is what's known as the gut-brain axis, that involves communication between our gut and our brain through our nervous system. Even the microbes that reside in our gut, our microbiome, can play a role in this gut-brain axis. And stress directly impacts how well we digest our food. And for some people, stress can really exacerbate symptoms for people who already have a very sensitive gut. And what I want to point out here when it comes to stress, definitely just stress in our life in general, but the stress that we might feel around food, so if we have a fear of food or a food phobia, or we have a lot of anxiety around a certain type of food or ingredient, can in some cases affect how well we digest that food. Our mind is powerful. So for example, if you really truly believe that gluten is harmful to your health, then we might feel worse eating it, or we might be very hypervigilant if we consume it. Maybe about our body, we might be picking up on every tiny little thing that we feel. And likewise, if we really truly believe that gluten-free is healthier for us, then we might feel better choosing that option. So again, I want to reiterate here that there's no doubt that there can be issues with digesting gluten for some people. There's no doubt about that. But it's wise to really consider all sides of the equation here. I know I mentioned, FODMAPs and lectins and that, but what I want to mention here is, when it comes to gluten-containing foods that a lot of us eat maybe in a kind of more standard way, like burgers or pancakes or, I don't know, French fries that are cross-contaminated with gluten, or, creamy sauces. Sometimes these foods, just the way that they're prepared and the other things that they're typically eaten with, can kind of make our gut not feel the best. If you choose to have a salad with grilled chicken on top instead of a burger, you might feel better. And again, it could very well be the gluten for you, but it's just very possible that it's not the gluten, and it's just the fact that you are also avoiding things that are deep fried, or have maple syrup all over them, and all these other things that might just not be making your gut feel all that great. So just something to consider. So I just want to point out here, before I move on to a couple other things that I want to talk about here, that if you suspect that you have issues with digesting gluten specifically, it's very, very important that you speak to your doctor and you get tested for conditions like celiac disease, for example. You also want to make sure that you are not going gluten-free before you get tested for some of these things, so that the tests can properly pick up on if you are reacting to gluten or not. So I want to move on to just kind of cover what one of the experts on gluten says about gluten consumption. So if you are someone who loves research and like nutrition science, perhaps you have come across Dr. Alessio Fasano. So he is a pediatric gastroenterologist. He's also a researcher and professor at Harvard Medical School. He's also the founder of the Center for Celiac Research, and he's a really cool guy, super, super smart guy. Dr. Alessio Fasano discovered something known as zonulin. So zonulin is a protein that basically, our intestines are lined with microvilli, okay? These little finger-like projections that help to increase the surface area of our intestinal tract. And the cells that line our intestines are just one cell thick, okay? And they are held together by what are known as tight junctions, okay? And these tight junctions do open up sometimes. Things need to pass through when we're digesting food. However, zonulin, what Dr. Alessio Fasano discovered, is that zonulin can kind of cause those tight junctions to open up when they're not necessarily supposed to. And people with celiac disease, for example, that zonulin has a much bigger effect on them. However, what people have sort of done with his work is sort of taken what he's discovered and then said that, everyone needs to avoid gluten, and then, not looking at the whole picture. So there is a really great little interview from Dr. Alessio Fasano on the website, the Celiac Disease Foundation's website, that I will leave linked below. But basically what he says is that, it appears that we don't digest gluten completely for the most part, and it appears that the human body can almost see it as like a component of bacteria, and we sort of try to attack it, but that what happens in our bodies is a very controlled reaction. Our body fights it off and nothing happens, and that a very small number of people will lose that battle and go on to develop things like celiac disease, wheat allergy, or gluten sensitivity. So simply put, what I want to say here, after all that I've talked about, is that there's insufficient evidence that suggests that those who have healthy intestinal tissue should avoid gluten, permanently, or if there's, no medical condition warranting its restriction. So I want to share with you a few tips for how you can digest grains better, just in general. So my first tip here is to try some ancient grains. So grains like spelt, kamut, einkorn, or emmer wheat. Actually, einkorn wheat specifically, which is more of an ancient wheat, contains 14 chromosomes versus the 42 chromosomes of today's dwarf wheat, which has been, hybridized many a time. And so these types of grains might be better tolerated for some people. In some cases, they may even be more nutritious than our modern wheat. So for example, kamut has a higher antioxidant content. My second tip here is to try sourdough bread. So I did mention this a little bit, but sourdough is a very traditional style, slow fermented bread that's just made with flour and water. I have a sourdough starter in my fridge. If you want to read how you can make a sourdough starter, I did create a blog post on it, so I will leave leave that linked below. But these do tend to be better digested because of all that fermentation that the flour has undergone. They also tend to be lower in FODMAPs as well. Number 3 is to try sprouting your grains. So this is something that you can do. Either you can do it yourself, right? You can, even like legumes, grains, these things can be sprouted in jars. That helps to reduce the phytate content that can make them, harder to digest, harder on the gut. That anti-nutrient content, it's also known as. So soaking and sprouting is really helpful here. You can also buy some of these things already made, like sprouted bread, sprouted tortillas, things like that. I really like the brand Silver Hills. I like to buy their bread sometimes, or Food for Life makes a sprouted, like Ezekiel bread they call it. So these are just some things to look for. I also just want to say that I personally believe that we can all benefit from exploring the many different kinds of grains that exist besides just wheat. This includes ones that don't contain gluten, but wheat is not the only grain that's available, even though it's found in so many different things, right? But it's one of the reasons why it's actually a great idea for us to try the many grains that exist, like amaranth and teff and millet and sorghum and rice and oats, and then of course other ones that I've mentioned like spelt and kamut and einkorn, which are other variations of wheat. But what I'm trying to say is that there's so many grains than just wheat. And lastly, I really want to say this here. If you don't have issues with gluten here, it is okay to just enjoy a non-sprouted, non-sourdough, non-ancient grain, cupcake or slice of bread, whatever. The tips that I just shared with you here are there for you if you need them, but there's no need to feel paralyzed with fear or anxiety when it comes to consuming gluten. Just, enjoy yourself. It's okay. Alrighty, so to finish things off here today, I just want to say that I am in no way here to tell you what you should or shouldn't eat. That's completely up to you. You know your body best. You know your body best and what makes you feel your best. Coming from someone who has struggled in the past with very severe digestive problems and major flare-ups and chronic diarrhea, I know how difficult it is and how relieving it is to find something that works for you. So if eating gluten-free is something that works for you, then I applaud you. That's great, and I'm glad that you have found something that helps. Coming from my experience, for actually several years I was on a gluten-free diet, but I no longer actually suffer from major digestive problems anymore. As a result, I did decide to reintroduce gluten back into my diet because I started to feel like I didn't want to restrict gluten unnecessarily, because food restriction can definitely give us a lot of anxiety and fear around food. Just something to think about. Thank you so much for watching. I really hope that you found this video helpful. I know that, nutrition topics can be very confusing, but I hope that I was able to provide some clarity in this video. I also have a whole entire blog post up on everything that I talked about today, so I will leave that linked below if you want to just read through what I talked about today. And I will see you all in my next one.